You're crouched in tall grass on the African savanna. Lightning just split the sky open. Somewhere ahead, the horizon is turning the color of a struck match. The air already smells like burning grass and something else you don't have a word for yet. Every muscle in your body is already screaming at you to run, not toward it, away from it, as fast as your legs can carry you, no questions asked, no committee meeting required. That's a survival program a few million years in the making, and it still runs today, mostly unedited. You've felt it yourself. A fire alarm goes off at work. It's probably just someone's burnt popcorn in the break room, but your whole body is halfway out the door before your brain gets a vote. Same thing happens at home. A candle tips over. A pan catches for 2 seconds too long. And suddenly you're a caveman again, swatting at it like it insulted your entire bloodline. If every instinct we have says run from fire, how did we end up as the one species on the planet that carries a lighter in its pocket? The one that lights candles for a birthday and roasts marshmallows for fun? Fear of fire isn't some quirky human hang-up we developed later. Almost everything that breathes shares it, from insects to elephants to your own dog when the fireworks start. Even our closest living relatives treat it with real calculated caution. Jill Pruetz, an anthropologist who has spent years studying savanna chimpanzees at the Fongoli site in Senegal, published research in 2015 documenting something strange. Her chimps didn't panic and scatter when wildfires swept through their home range. They watched the flames, tracked which direction the fire was moving, and rerouted around it like commuters checking a traffic app before a road trip. They understood fire well enough to predict it. They just never touched it. Not once. Not even close. That's the ceiling almost every animal on Earth hits. And it's a pretty high ceiling. You can respect fire. You can even outthink it a little, the way Pruetz's chimps clearly did, but actually reaching into it and taking some home with you? That's a different level of insanity entirely. And for millions of years, nothing alive was crazy enough to try it. This is almost unfair to every other species. Psychologists Felix Warneken and Alexander Rosati ran an experiment published in 2015 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. They offered captive chimpanzees raw and cooked sweet potato side by side. The chimps picked cooked, overwhelmingly, given a device that appeared to cook raw food. Some of them waited instead of eating the raw piece already in front of them. These chimps understood that cooked food was better. They valued patience over an easy snack. They were ready customers for fire. What they didn't have, and still don't have anywhere on Earth, is the ability to make fire themselves. They can want the outcome all day long. They just can't build the machine that produces it. Here's the thing. Nobody tells you about our own ancestors. The first fire they ever used probably wasn't theirs at all. It was borrowed. And not exactly with permission. After a lightning strike or a wildfire tore through the grasslands, early hominins likely followed the smoke the same way vultures follow a kill they didn't make, not to fight the fire, to scavenge whatever it left behind on its way through. Roasted seeds scattered across scorched earth, slow animals too injured or too confused to outrun the flames, meat that had gone from raw to cooked without anyone lifting a single finger for it. Free calories, already seasoned by the universe itself. Why on earth would you say no to that? But scavenging a wildfire is not the same thing as controlling one. And this is where most animals stop for good. A wildfire burns out. It moves on with zero regard for your schedule. It doesn't care whether you're hungry again tomorrow or next week or during a particularly rough stretch of dry season at some point. Something had to change, and it had to change dramatically. So what actually happened? Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. In 2012, a team led by archaeologist Francesco Berna published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining Wonderwerk cave in South Africa. Deep inside the cave, well past where daylight even reaches, they found ash and burned bone fragments dated to roughly 1 million years ago. That location matters more than almost anything else in this story. A natural wildfire cannot wander 100 meters into a pitch-black cave and set up camp on its own. Somebody carried it in there on purpose, and then somebody kept it alive long enough to leave a mark still readable 1 million years later. Somebody deliberately carried this fire, tended it, fed it, and kept it alive in a place it could never have reached by itself. That single detail flips the entire narrative on its head, and it wasn't a one-off either, which honestly makes it more convincing. At Gesher, Benot, Yaakov in Israel, archaeologist Naama Goren-Inbar and her team documented something published in the journal Science back in 2004. Burned flint and charred wood turned up clustered in the same specific spots across layer after layer of sediment, dated to around 790,000 years ago. Fire doesn't return to the exact same 6-foot patch of ground for roughly 300,000 years by pure accident. Something or someone kept relighting it in that same corner, over and over, generation after generation. Like a family that keeps using the same burner on the stove without ever quite deciding to. So somewhere between blind terror and building a permanent hearth, our ancestors crossed a line no other species has crossed since, before or after. What actually pushed them across it? The story gets messier here, and I like it more for that. Not everyone agrees on when occasional use turned into habitual use, and this isn't a small disagreement. Archaeologists Will Robrix and Paula Villa published a survey in 2011, also in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, looking across dozens of European sites. Their conclusion was blunter than you'd expect. Widespread, persistent, everyday fire use doesn't show up clearly in the European record until somewhere around 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, hundreds of thousands of years after Wonderwerk. That's not a small gap, that's an entire era. So, which is it? Was fire mastered once, early in Africa, and then used only sporadically for a very long time afterward? Or did Africa run on a completely different timeline than Europe? Nobody has a clean answer, and any documentary that tells you otherwise is smoothing over a real, unresolved argument between actual researchers. This is where the story stops being just about archaeology and starts being about biology instead. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard, laid out an argument in his 2009 book Catching Fire that reframed the entire question from the ground up. His claim wasn't just that fire helped us out occasionally. It was that fire made us physically into the species sitting here reading this right now. Cooking breaks food down chemically before your body ever has to lift a finger. A cooked yam hands over dramatically more usable calories than a raw one, for the same amount of chewing and the same amount of gut effort. Multiply that advantage across 1 million meals, across 100,000 years of meals, and you're not just feeding a body anymore, you're funding a brain. Human brains are expensive to run, burning through roughly 1/5 of our entire daily energy budget while sitting here doing nothing more athletic than reading these sentences. No other primate spends anywhere close to that percentage. Anthropologists Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed a matching explanation back in 1995, the expensive tissue hypothesis. As hominin brains ballooned, guts shrank because a smaller, easier to fuel gut freed up the energy budget a bigger brain demanded. A shorter gut doesn't work on raw, fibrous food nearly as well. It works beautifully on food that's already been half digested by fire before it ever reaches your mouth. That's a nicer way of saying your ancestors outsourced part of their own digestion to a campfire and never looked back. Try eating a raw potato sometime. If you want a small, humbling reminder of what your gut can actually manage on its own. Your stomach will remember it for days. Does that mean fire single-handedly built the human brain all on its own? Probably not entirely. But it's hard to look at the timing, the energy math, and the shrinking gut evidence together and call all three a coincidence? Not every researcher is fully sold on that story, though, and their objection is a fair one. Wrangham's timeline needs fire to show up early, right around the emergence of Homo erectus, roughly 1.9 million years ago. That's exactly when brains start growing and guts start shrinking in the fossil record. But the strongest confirmed fire evidence we have, Wonderwerk Cave, only reaches back about 1 million years. That leaves a gap of roughly 900,000 years between the biological change, the theory needs, and the physical proof we can actually hold in our hands. Critics point out that fossils don't lie, but they also don't always survive. Ash disappears. Charcoal washes away. 1 million years is an unimaginably long time for physical evidence to simply not survive. The behavior itself could have been happening quietly in the background the whole time. So, is the fire cooking story too early for its own evidence, or is the evidence just late to catch up with a much older habit? Neither side has landed a knockout punch yet, and honestly, that's kind of the whole point of good science. The debate is still open, which is a very different thing from the question being unanswered. But fire didn't just change what our ancestors ate, it changed what they did with the extra hours it handed them. Before fire, the day basically ended at sunset, the same way it does for every other primate on the planet right now. No exceptions. Once the light goes, so does the activity, because sitting still in the dark is the only thing keeping you off a leopard's dinner menu. Fire broke that rule completely. A flame pushes predators back, lights a small circle of relative safety, and suddenly the night isn't just something to survive, it's something you get to use. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner spent years recording conversations among the Juhonsi, a sand community in the Kalahari. She published her findings in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. She compared what people talked about during the day against what they talked about after dark, around the fire, and the difference was almost comically stark. Daytime talk was mostly complaints, logistics, and gossip about who did what to whom. Practical stuff, nothing you'd want to build a civilization on. Firelight talk was different. It shifted towards stories, myths, and the kind of shared cultural memory that actually gets passed down to kids sitting there half listening, half falling asleep against someone's shoulder. The campfire might be one of humanity's oldest classrooms, and nobody ever had to raise their hand. That single shift from daylight logistics to firelight storytelling might matter just as much as the calories did. A well-fed brain that never hears a story is still just a well-fed brain. Give it firelight and suddenly it's sitting in the very first lecture hall our species ever built. A job ethnographers have recorded in hunter-gatherer societies on nearly every continent might explain that gap between using fire and creating it from nothing. Someone was always in charge of the flame itself, because losing it could mean weeks without one. Coals traveled wrapped in bark or smoldering slowly inside a hollow log, carried by hand from one camp to the next. They were something closer to a pet than a tool. Let it die on a bad, wet night, and there was no guarantee anyone in the group actually knew how to summon a new one from scratch. That single fact reframes the whole timeline. Maybe control came first, centuries or millennia before creation. Maybe entire generations lived their whole lives tending a flame that had been burning, in one form or another, since long before they were born. Not one of them ever needed to strike a spark themselves. One piece of this still doesn't fully add up, and it's kind of satisfying that it doesn't. We still don't have a confirmed date for when humans crossed from opportunistic fire users to reliable fire starters. That's the difference between striking a spark on command and just keeping a borrowed one alive. Wonderwerk and Gesher Benot Yaakov both show controlled use of fire. Neither one proves ignition on demand. That specific moment, the true birth of I can make fire whenever I feel like it, is still missing from the record entirely. Maybe it happened once, in one place, and then spread outward from there. Maybe it happened independently, in a dozen different valleys, invented by a dozen different groups, who each had their own version of a very bad, very smoky Tuesday. We genuinely don't know yet, and any channel that tells you they do with total confidence is guessing harder than the evidence allows. What we do know is this. Somewhere in that long gap between fear and mastery, something changed. A species that should have run from every flame it ever saw instead learned to sit close enough to shape one, feed one, and depend on one completely. Think about how strange that actually is for a second. Every other animal that ever met fire either fled it, ignored it, or died to it. We're the only one that pulled up a chair. You're not so different from that first hominin, still flinching at a fire alarm, still hardwired to bolt for the nearest exit at the first whiff of smoke. The only real difference is that somewhere behind you right now, in your kitchen, on your stove, there's a flame you lit on purpose. One your ancestors would have sprinted from on-site screaming without a second thought, and somehow over the better part of 1,000,000 years, one campfire at a time, that exact fear quietly turned into a room you're perfectly comfortable sitting in.